Cerebral, artistic, and sapphic. It's time to take a trip to Camp Miasma.
Someone's gotta be here when Little Death comes back.
Little Death isn't real.
Well, not with that attitude, he isn't.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve. I'm an independent film and television critic, and I love to see a bit of yearning back in a theatrical release. Today, I'm reviewing Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma, the latest offering from director Jane Schoenbrun, who is best known to the cinephiles for their previous film, I Saw the TV Glow, a film which stars Justice Smith, whom I recently found out has been cast to play Harris in Heated Rivalry Season 2. That is a phenomenal casting choice, by the way. Having seen him in many other things, I know he can deliver the energy and personable, endearing qualities of that character. I Saw the TV Glow also stars Jack Haven, who is now one of the leads of Camp Miasma. The thing about this movie is that it's nice, it's different, it's unusual. It's a love letter to various classic horror films while also flipping the genre's tropes and conventions upside down. Instead of a simple slasher, we see a maladaptive daydream probing into yearning, desire, and discovery. If you don't already know, I will tell you. This movie is about a 29-year-old filmmaker, Chris, played by the ever-so-iconic Hannah Einbinder, who has been hired to direct a reboot, a resurrection, as it were, of a long-running horror film series that has been on a downward spiral for quite some time. As part of her creative development process, Chris travels to meet with Billy Presley, played by Gillian Anderson. Billy played the final girl of the first Camp Miasma film. Chris is openly queer and very aware of the expectations that the industry higher-ups have placed upon her because of that identity and perspective. They want her to resurrect a practically dead horror IP for their own financial gain, and do so by making it elevated horror, and something that will rework the problematic story aspects of the original Camp Miasma, not because they actually care about having empathy for the groups that might have been harmed or taken issue with the problematic ideas presented in the old Camp Miasma film, but because these higher-ups want a new audience to pay money to see a new Camp Miasma film, which they presumably will not do if they were to continue to perpetuate problematic stereotypes. Now is probably a good time to point out that if you are not familiar with certain conventions of the horror genre, particularly slashers, stories that take place out somewhere in the woods, you might struggle to follow what this new story is doing. It's not shy about making its influences very clear. You have a killer emerging from the water, among other things that feels reminiscent of certain aspects of the Friday the 13th series. When Chris is on her way to meet Billy for the first time, she stops at a gas station to pick up snacks. How many times by now have we seen horror films where the main group of characters stop at a gas station at the beginning of their journey and probably have an encounter with an unfriendly local while there, who will of course say something ominous and foreboding. There's also, unsurprisingly, a heavy influence from Sleepaway Camp. If you don't know about Sleepaway Camp and the discourse that has unfolded from that film, I struggle to imagine how you will see Camp Miasma and follow more of the layers of its story. The very nature of older films being deemed problematic as the decades go by, or being reinterpreted and reclaimed as relating to certain marginalized perspectives, that's all woven into the fabric of this story. When you watch something like Camp Miasma, it becomes evident how different a movie feels when it's being made from the singular perspective of a creative storyteller versus being made by a bunch of corporate interests all vying for their ideas to override others, probably for the sake of financial profit as opposed to making a really good story. One thing I would note is that something like Camp Miasma, I don't think it's a film that works for people who do not already have a passion for film and are probably as well following the ongoings of the film industry. There is so much commentary in this movie about conventions and tropes of the horror genre, the current state of Hollywood as an industry, this push for finding a way to jolt life back into pre-existing IPs to maximize profits. If you're just a casual moviegoer who only goes to the cinema when there is an extremely mainstream, commercial, popular movie releasing, you might be confused by the surrealism and eccentricities of a film like Camp Miasma. That being said, if you're someone that's bothering to watch a movie review on YouTube about the latest Jane Schoenbrun film that won a special award at the Cannes Film Festival, you're probably in the know to enough of an extent to find something to appreciate in Camp Miasma. As Chris and Billy begin to get to know one another better, they begin to spiral deeper into a type of psychosexual madness. But it's also, in many ways, less about madness as it is about revealing the true desire and longing within oneself. It's about having a personal breakthrough to be liberated from feeling repressed. Jack Haven plays the villain of Camp Miasma, the often masked killer who is responsible for the slashing one would expect to see in a brand new slasher film. The material they give that character is something incredibly unique. Oftentimes there is a stillness and stoicism to a lot of these types of masked figures in horror series. They're less likely to speak or emote, and you're probably going to know very limited information about them, but in this, what they're doing with the character is blurring the lines between reality and fiction in a way that feels wholly innovative to the long-standing pattern we see nowadays of meta-storytelling and reboots being a trend that has now started to grow stale. If there's one nitpick I would offer to critique Camp Miasma, it's that some of the VFX that are used for some of the slasher sequences were not quite done to the standard that I personally would have liked. It would cause brief flashes of breaking my immersion in the story. Apart from that, though, it's a very beautifully put together, stylish film. There's a dreamy warmth to this that we almost never see nowadays in new horror films or slasher films specifically. There was even a point where we see Chris walking in front of what's seemingly meant to be the snowy backdrop of the forest setting, but you can clearly see the texture of a painted backdrop, and that's an example of how Camp Miasma blurs the line between the viewer of film and the characters in a film. Hannah Einbinder and Gillian Anderson have incredible chemistry. If their connection wasn't believable, this movie simply would not work. It hinges on the experience of luxuriating in that connection between them, but also of Chris exploring and uncovering certain things within herself.
Sex seems so easy for so many people, but I've never been able to get there with someone else unless I'm really far away in my head.
I've mostly stayed vague and broad in talking about the film thus far, but now I want to be able to talk about some of the material with greater specificity. That does not mean that I'm going to spoil everything that's in Camp Miasma, but maybe some details that you might not already know if you haven't watched any promotional interviews about the film. This movie is heavily inspired by Jane Schoenbrun learning to enjoy sex after transitioning. They have spoken in interviews about previously feeling dysphoric and repressed within their body, and as a result, not being able to enjoy those experiences of physical intimacy with their spouse. In this new movie, Chris opens up to Billy about how she struggles to enjoy sex, and Hannah Einbinder performs the hell out of what's more or less a monologue about how on the rare occasions when she is able to finish, she's essentially engaging in maladaptive daydreaming. She's imagining herself as being in the original Camp Miasma movie. This movie was something that Chris watched when she was young. The original Camp Miasma film that Billy starred in was something very formative to Chris when she was growing up. Chris tells Billy that it facilitated her queer awakening. Chris also says in this monologue that when she's engaging in this maladaptive daydreaming, she imagines herself transforming into this or that character from the movie. On the one hand, it's not exactly subtle in its storytelling. It's very matter-of-fact in presenting Jane's perspective as the writer and director of this movie. However, if you do not know that Jane is transfeminine and non-binary, you might be very confused when watching Camp Miasma for the first time. Moreover, Jack Haven, who plays the killer in this movie, the character's name is Little Death. For anyone who didn't already know this, Little Death is also known as La Petite Mort. I already knew about this expression, and as such, when I was watching this film for the first time, and I learned that this was the character's name, It was a massive clue as to what this story was going to be talking about or what it was alluding to. I didn't look up interviews of Jane talking about this film until after I had watched it for the first time. Moreover, when you see Little Death's backstory, who they were before they became a masked killer running around slashing people, they're said to be someone that would alternate spending time as a boy or a girl. And then Little Death makes a very specific face or a facial expression. And it was immediately apparent that that was being done as an homage to Sleepaway Camp. Again, if you are not already familiar with Sleepaway Camp and the discourse that has followed that film since it was released, it's difficult to conceptualize how you're going to understand that reference and the role that it plays in Camp Miasma. Little Death makes this face, and it's shown more than once in the film. Spoilers for Sleepaway Camp, by the way, a film that is over 40 years old. The ending of Sleepaway Camp has sparked loads of discourse where some have tried to claim that it's problematic and painting transgender folks in a negative light, but others have made the argument that if we're really being technical, Angela, the person who is revealed to be the killer, is not a trans character. Angela is a boy who's been forced to live as a girl. The face that Angela is making at the end is so known and recognizable to cinephiles, and in particular fans of the horror genre, that of course all of those people will recognize it as being baked into the DNA of Jane's new film, Camp Miasma. If you don't know about Sleepaway Camp, this is rather significant context that is going to completely fly over your head, and then I have no idea what you are going to experience when watching Jane's new film. Broadly speaking, this relationship between Sleepaway Camp and Camp Miasma is showing the nature of how formative art is to the people that it reaches, especially at a younger age. The specificity of Jane's vision is evident. The story of Camp Miasma is about being able to better connect to one's sexuality after transitioning, but anyone that's fallen deeply in love with the filmmaking medium, with storytelling as an art form, should still be able to see something of themselves in Camp Miasma. You would presumably have your own version of having a work of art that was profound and formative to you, particularly when you were growing up. I also really love that we have a new horror movie that is joyful, by the way. Do you know how tired I am of these new horror movies that believe that all that it takes to fulfill the brief of being something from the horror genre is be as disgusting and mean-spirited as possible? Forget that noise. It's time for Camp Miasma, where you get your rocks off, fall in love with a woman, and enjoy the creative and personal breakthroughs that follow as a result. To the industry at large, keep cutting Jane checks for new movies for them to make. We will be watching.
Oh, it's happening! It's happening! Camp Miasma.